When we think of the French Revolution, we usually picture the big stuff, right? The storming of the Bastille in 1789, but that was really the explosion, not the fuse. The real story, the part that explains why it all happened, is a century-long slow burn. It's a story about three kings whose choices and, well, their failures, set the stage for one of the most world-changing events in history.
And that brings us to the big question historians still argue about. Was the revolution just bound to happen? An unstoppable force France was hurtling towards no matter what? Or was it the result of specific mistakes, a series of bad Gauls that maybe could have been avoided? That's what we're going to dig into today.
See, to find the answer, we can't just start in 1789. We've got to rewind the clock a full 100 years. The roots of the revolution, they were planted by Louis XVI's predecessors, Louis XIV and XV, who built this incredible, magnificent, but deeply flawed system that their heir just couldn't handle.
So, let's start with the most famous of them all, Louis XIV, the Sun King. From his incredible palace at Versailles, he built a monarchy with absolute power and just dazzling splendor. But underneath all that gold, he was creating a system that was, well, fundamentally brittle. Louis XIV basically perfected the whole absolute monarch thing. He created this huge, centralized state where everything revolved around one person, a strong, decisive king calling all the shots. But this set a really dangerous precedent. It created this expectation that the king had to be brilliant, which, as you'll see, was a standard his successors just couldn't live up to.
And here's the hidden cost of all that glory. Think of this as an X-ray of the French state. Louis's constant wars, insanely expensive, and he paid for them by borrowing and borrowing. And just look at the foundation of the state, the third estate, the regular people. They're carrying the entire weight of taxes, while the nobility and the clergy, they're barely paying a thing. This wasn't just bad accounting. It was a recipe for massive resentment.
In this quote, it just nails the Sun King's legacy. On the outside, France looked like the superpower of Europe, but on the inside, its bank account was empty and its whole social structure was dangerously out of whack. He left behind a powerful state for sure, but a brittle one. So next up is Louis XV. He gets handed this brittle state, and, well, through a mix of just not making decisions and some pretty bad political moves, he basically lets every single one of those cracks get wider and deeper.
And during his reign, France gets stuck in this political death spiral. It went like this. The king would suggest some crucial tax reform, like maybe making the nobles pay their fair share. But then the regional high courts, these groups called the parliaments, they'd block it. And Louis XV? He kept backing down. With every retreat, the parliaments got more powerful. And the crazy part is, these nobles started framing themselves as defenders of liberty against a tyrant king, all while just protecting their own tax-free perks.
Meanwhile, the whole magic of the monarchy was just fading. The king's reputation was getting hammered by stories of corruption and scandals at court. And then, and this was a big one, France suffered a humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War, losing most of its global empire. The monarchy wasn't just looking corrupt anymore. It was starting to look weak.
Then, right at the end of his life, a final, massive move. In what's called the Mack-Poole coup, he just completely dismantled the parliaments, finally clearing the way for real reform. This was the moment. It could have been the turning point to save the whole system. But just 3 years later, the king died, and that last-ditch effort, it died right along with him.
And that brings us to the man of the hour, the final king, Louis XVI. Now, he inherited a state that was already in a deep, deep crisis. But here's the thing, revolution was not yet inevitable. It was his specific choices and his fatal indecisiveness that would finally push the whole kingdom right over the edge. Think about it. The system Louis XIV built needed a king with authority, with vision, with ambition. And what France got with Louis XVI was a man defined by hesitation. He was exactly the wrong guy at exactly the worst possible time.
So one of his first big gambles? Funding the American War of Independence. Now, it was sweet revenge against Great Britain, no doubt. But for France's bank account, it was a total catastrophe. The war literally doubled the national debt, pushing France from a crisis to the absolute edge of bankruptcy. There was just no way to ignore the problem anymore.
And from there, the blunders just kept coming. His very first act as king, he brought back the parliaments. He undid the one bold move his grandfather made and basically handed power back to his biggest opponents. Then, over and over, he'd back some ambitious financial reform, but the second he faced any pushback, he'd retreat. The final mistake? Calling the Estates General in 1789. He thought he could control it. Instead, he basically just opened the floodgates.
So let's go back to our big question. Was the revolution inevitable? After tracing this century-long slow burn, you have to say no. France was in crisis, for sure, but it wasn't doomed by destiny.
You can actually see the off-ramps, the moments where history could have taken a totally different turn. What if he had fully supported the economic reforms of his minister, Turgot, instead of caving? What if he'd just kept the parliaments shut down like his grandfather did? These weren't small choices. They were absolutely pivotal. Specific decisions, not some abstract fate, paved the road to 1789.
In the end, it's like this. The French state was a building with a foundation that had been weakening for 100 years. It was fragile, absolutely, but it wasn't doomed to fall. The final collapse came when all that pressure met a leader who was just defined by indecision. A century of problems created the crisis, but it took a king paralyzed by hesitation to turn that crisis into a full-blown revolution.
It really leaves you with a fascinating question, doesn't it? The French Revolution shows us how the slow, long drift of history can create a crisis. But it also proves that the choices of just a few people in those critical moments can determine whether that crisis ends in reform or in revolution.